Promises provide a critical asynchronous pattern. Many APIs make use of promises, so they are something that you should invest some time in learning. Now, as we get started with promises, we first need to talk about what a promise is. Basically, a promise is a representation of some future event. Something is going to happen in the future, and when it happens, it will return a value. That value will either be a resolved value, meaning a successful value, or a not resolved, or a rejected value, meaning unsuccessful. Because this is happening in the future, we can monitor that promise so that when that happens, when it's resolved or rejected, we can retrieve that value. So how are promises represented in JavaScript? Well, as you may have guessed, they are an object. So many things are objects in JavaScript, and promises are no exception. They are a special type of object. Let's take a look at some promise objects, and then we will learn how to use them. So in order to generate a promise, I've created a simple function here. I've called it an async function, and notice inside the function, basically it uses set timeout. So I'm creating a promise here. We won't worry about the syntax of this at this point, but I'm creating a promise so that so this will return a promise, this function will return a promise. We can deal with it as a promise instead of just using set timeout, which would require us to deal with it with a callback. I have a callback in here, which is part of what I've structured in the promise. Okay, don't worry so much about the syntax here. We'll deal with that later. What I really want to look at is what it produces. When it returns a promise, we're returning a promise, what we get. And also notice it's going to go for 4 milliseconds. Okay. All right. That is the amount we have to wait for that future event, the promise's future event, before it is resolved. Notice here it's only going to resolve. It won't reject. I haven't set anything up for it to reject. So it will be successful. So if we jump out right here, and I simply set up a variable, let promise, I'm just gonna call it that, equal async function. So I'm gonna go ahead and press return. That's going to return a promise. Now if I take a look at that promise, right away, notice that the promise is pending. Now promises can have one of 3 statuses. It can be fulfilled, rejected, or pending. So fulfilled would be successful, rejected would be if it were not successful. Pending is what its current state is before something's happened. Now if I open this up, we can see there are different parts to this promise object. We can see a state and we can see results. Notice how the state is now fulfilled, and that's because the 4 seconds have passed. Now if I type in the variable again, it will show fulfilled up here, and it will provide a value. That is the value that we're waiting for. Fulfilled, and here's the value. Okay, so the value that we receive is because it was successful, because it was fulfilled. But the important thing to notice here, this is an object. It's an object that represents some future event, something that's going to happen in the future. So we can monitor this object for that thing to occur. Once it occurs, we can then retrieve the value. And the value can help us to identify whether it was successful or not successful. And we can get something from that value as well. So we now know what a promise is, how it is represented in JavaScript. So let's now look at how we use them.